They laughed when the single dad showed up in work boots to a luxury blind date. She smirked, made a joke about standards, then stood up and walked out laughing. He didn't argue, didn't chase her, just calmly finished his drink and stood. What no one there understood was how badly they misread the quiet man sitting across from her. This story isn't about dating embarrassment. It's about dignity being tested in rooms that measure worth by the wrong metrics. Before a decorated general freezes mid-step and raises his hand in salute, you need to see how invisible power really works and why some men choose shadows over spotlights even when the cost is steep. The laughter hung longer than it should have, the kind that pretends to be casual but lands with intent. A few heads turned away out of politeness. Others stayed fixed, curious how a man like him would react when dismissed so openly in a space designed to exclude him. Marcus Reed gave them nothing dramatic, just a slow breath and steady posture that suggested he'd survived worse judgment in places that mattered more. The chair slid back without noise, as if even the furniture respected the moment he chose to stand and reclaim what remained of an evening already fractured beyond repair. The Riverside Grand Hotel's executive lounge reflected tailored suits and delicate heels on polished marble floors, not scuffed steel-toed boots or maintenance badges clipped near the waist. Every surface gleamed under soft amber lighting that cost more to install than most people earned in a month. Crystal clinked against crystal. Conversations murmured in the cadence of money discussing itself without ever naming the amounts. Marcus stood there as if he had every right to exist in that space. Shoulders level, eyes calm, pulse unhurried despite the spectacle his presence had apparently created for the woman who'd agreed to meet him, and then changed her mind the moment she saw what he wore to earn a living. He was a single father before he was anything else. That truth anchored him more firmly than embarrassment ever could. The quiet discipline in his movements came from years of putting someone else first, from learning that dignity was not something handed out by strangers in expensive clothes, but something carried even when no one was watching, and especially when everyone was. Tonight was not about pride or proving anything to the blonde woman already halfway to the exit. It was about getting through the evening without incident, and going home to his son, who would ask how it went and deserved an answer that didn't carry the weight of his father's disappointment. The lounge staff resumed their routines once it became clear there would be no scene worth reporting. Glassware clinked. Low conversation returned. Somewhere below, the polished ceiling engines hummed and elevators ran, systems working in patterns most guests never noticed. Marcus noticed them all. He always did. It was habit, not curiosity, the instinct to track what mattered before it became urgent, to read the language buildings spoke in vibrations and temperature shifts, and the particular quality of silence that preceded mechanical failure. He turned away from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River and headed toward the service corridor. The invisible spine of the hotel where the real work happened, and people like him kept spaces like this functioning while remaining carefully unseen by those who paid premium rates to never think about the infrastructure supporting their comfort. The contrast was immediate. Warm lighting faded into functional brightness. Carpets gave way to floors meant for traction, not beauty. This was where he was expected to be, where no one asked questions or laughed at the gap between what he wore and what they assumed he could afford. The badge at his waist granted access without ceremony. Doors opened because they were designed to, not because anyone thought he was important. Marcus preferred it that way. Important people attracted attention. Attention led to complications. Complications threatened the fragile balance he had built for his child. A balance made of predictable hours, steady income, and the kind of anonymity that let a man with his particular history disappear into ordinary work and ordinary days without having to explain where he'd been or what he'd done before fatherhood became the only mission that mattered. A folded drawing rested in his pocket, edges soft from being handled too often. Crayon lines, uneven letters, a small house, with smoke rising from a crooked chimney and two stick figures standing in front holding hands. One tall, one small, both smiling far wider than reality allowed, but representing something true nonetheless. He touched it briefly, not to reassure himself, but to remember why he stayed invisible even when the world underestimated him. That small piece of paper mattered more than any stranger's opinion. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in a hospital corridor 3 years ago, when a nurse handed him a newborn son and told him his wife wouldn't be coming home. That sometimes life demanded sacrifices no one saw coming, and the only response that mattered was deciding who you'd become in the aftermath. Upstairs, preparations continued for the Veterans Gala. Schedules tightened, security checkpoints adjusted. Speakers rehearsed words about service and sacrifice beneath chandeliers that cost more than most annual salaries. The irony was not lost on Marcus. It never was. Grand speeches were easier than quiet responsibility. He'd seen enough of both to know which one carried weight when everything else fell apart. The polished world above him would celebrate men who'd served and then return to lives where people like him remained functionally invisible, noticed only when systems failed or someone needed a door held open by hands that knew how to work without being seen. A flicker in the overhead lights drew his attention as he reached the maintenance control room. Barely noticeable, the kind most people would ignore or attribute to age and deferred upkeep. Marcus did not ignore it. He logged it mentally, already tracing possible causes, already thinking 3 steps ahead about what small problems whispered before they grew teeth. Small problems had a way of becoming catastrophic when dismissed by those too comfortable to care, and comfort, he'd learned, was the enemy of vigilance in any environment where people's lives depended on systems working exactly as designed. He keyed into the panel, running a routine check while the building breathed around him. Everything appeared normal on the surface. That meant nothing. Systems rarely failed loudly at first. They whispered. The trick was listening when everyone else was too busy or too certain to pay attention to the things that mattered most. Above him, laughter echoed again, this time from a different crowd. Unaware of how thin the line was between order and chaos, between the gala proceeding as planned and 300 people trapped in darkness wondering why nobody thought to check the fundamentals before staging an event that pushed every circuit to its limit. Marcus closed the panel and moved on, posture relaxed, senses alert. The night was not finished with him yet. It never was. Disasters announced themselves in whispers before they screamed, and he'd learned to hear what others missed during 10 years in places where missing signals meant body bags and grieving families, and the particular weight of knowing you could have prevented it if someone had just listened when you said the wiring looked wrong or the pattern felt off or something about this setup doesn't match the load calculations we need to stay safe. The gala would begin soon. Guests would arrive in formal wear and practice smiles. Someone would give a speech about heroism and duty. Marcus would remain below, monitoring systems, doing the work nobody celebrated until something went catastrophically wrong and they needed someone who knew what they were doing to fix it before the building burned or people got hurt, or the kind of failure that made headlines replaced the carefully curated narrative of success the hotel's management preferred to project. He checked his phone. A text from Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who watched Dylan when late shifts demanded it. "All good here. He's drawing you another picture. Wants to know when you'll be home." Marcus typed back, "Around 11. Make sure he takes his inhaler before bed." The response came immediately. "Always do. He's a good kid, Marcus." The best, Marcus thought, but didn't type. Pocketing the phone and returning his focus to the work that kept food on their table and rent paid and Dylan's asthma medication covered by insurance. That came with jobs like this, jobs that required no explanations about the years before fatherhood concealed everything else. He stepped deeper into the service corridor, the sound of the lounge fading behind steel doors and concrete walls. The air changed down here, cooler and sharper, carrying the smell of cleaning solution and warm machinery. This was the part of the building that never pretended. Pipes ran where they were needed. Wires were exposed because function mattered more than appearance. He walked it the way some people walk their own homes, without hesitation, without fear, knowing every junction box and breaker panel and the particular quirks that came with aging infrastructure pushed beyond its original design parameters. The panel he'd just checked stayed in his thoughts. The flicker had been small, almost polite, but patterns like that rarely announced themselves without reason. He moved toward the secondary electrical room, boots steady on concrete, shoulders loose. No rush. Rushing made mistakes, and mistakes had consequences he could not afford with a 7-year-old waiting at home, who still asked every night if Daddy promised to come back, who still woke sometimes from nightmares about being alone, who carried the legacy of loss in ways that broke Marcus's heart every time he thought about how much Elise had wanted to watch their son grow up and how unfair it was that she'd never get the chance. Inside the electrical room, the hum of systems wrapped around him like a familiar language. He rested one hand against the metal frame, feeling vibration through his palm, measuring rhythm the way he'd learned to in places where reading machinery meant the difference between completing a mission and triggering an explosion that sent everyone home in pieces. Everything worked, but not cleanly. Load distribution was uneven. Temporary setups from the gala were pulling more than they should. It was nothing management would worry about yet. It was exactly the kind of thing that grew teeth if ignored by people who measured risk in quarterly reports instead of worst-case scenarios. He adjusted a setting, then paused, considering whether to log it officially. Reports created paper trails. Paper trails created questions. Questions led to attention. Attention had a habit of dragging the past into the present, and the past was something Marcus needed to stay buried for Dylan's sake. He saved the data locally instead. A quiet compromise between responsibility and survival, between doing what was right and protecting what mattered most. A radio crackled nearby as security ran routine check-ins for the gala upstairs. Names were repeated, instructions echoed. Confidence was thick in every voice, the kind of confidence people carried when they'd never watched everything fall apart despite careful planning and good intentions. Confidence without awareness always bothered him. He'd seen where it led in a province whose name he didn't say out loud anymore, where commanders ignored warnings from specialists who knew better and soldiers paid for that arrogance with their lives. The service elevator doors slid open at the end of the corridor, revealing a cleaning cart and a young staff member nervously checking a clipboard. The kid looked up, clearly relieved to see someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. Marcus returned the nod and stepped inside, pressing the button for the lower maintenance level instead of the lobby. He did not need to be near the gala. Not yet. The elevator shuddered once as it descended. Just once. His hand lifted automatically, bracing against the rail muscles, reacting before thought caught up. The motion smoothed out, but the message was clear. The building was under strain, pushed harder than it should be, by people who thought infrastructure was invisible magic instead of carefully balanced systems requiring constant attention and respect. The doors opened again. The hallway was quieter here, almost peaceful. Storage rooms lined the walls. Emergency equipment sat untouched in its brackets, pristine from lack of use, because most people never thought about disasters until they were already happening, and it was too late to do anything except react and hope training mattered more than panic. Marcus checked the nearest kit, breaking the seal with practiced ease and resealing it properly after confirming everything was current and functional. Old habits did not fade. They waited. As he worked, fragments of the lounge replayed without permission. The laugh, the dismissal, the way Victoria Sterling had looked past him as if he were a temporary inconvenience instead of a person worth basic courtesy. It stung, but not the way it once might have. That version of him had burned away years ago, replaced by something harder and steadier. He'd learned not to confuse comfort with character, not to mistake polish for substance, not to let other people's shallow assessments determine his worth, when the only judgment that mattered came from a 7-year-old who thought his father was the best man in the world. Despite wearing work boots to dates and living in a 2-bedroom apartment that needed better heating, a vibration pulsed through the floor, subtle but wrong. He stilled, listening. The frequency was off, too sharp, the kind of signal that preceded failure in systems pushed beyond their limits. His jaw tightened. Somewhere above, something heavy shifted, followed by raised voices muffled by layers of concrete and steel. He moved toward the stairwell, not running but not wasting time either. This was how it always started. Noise, confusion, delay. People assuming someone else was handling it until the moment they realized nobody was, and the situation had already escalated beyond easy fixes. At the stairwell door he paused, hand hovering over the handle. The gala continued above, full of medals and speeches and polished certainty. Down here, the systems whispered warnings no one else was trained to hear or care about until catastrophe made ignoring them impossible. He straightened, centering himself, knowing exactly what he would do if those whispers turned into screams and people needed someone who understood how buildings worked to keep them from dying in the dark. He pushed the door open and started up the stairs, one measured step at a time, unaware that the path he was taking would soon place him in front of the very people who never thought to look his way, that tonight would strip away the invisibility he'd cultivated so carefully and force him to choose between the quiet life he'd built and the skills he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Marcus climbed without hurry but without hesitation, each step placed with the same measured intent he brought to everything else. The stairwell smelled faintly of dust and metal, the kind of place most guests never saw unless something had already gone wrong and panic drove them toward exits they couldn't find in normal circumstances. Emergency lights cast long shadows across concrete walls. The echo of distant voices filtered down from above, louder now, sharper around the edges, carrying the particular quality that preceded problems most people wouldn't recognize until events forced recognition. By the time he reached the mid-level landing, the noise had changed. It wasn't laughter anymore. It was confusion layered over impatience, the sound of people who expected things to work because they always had. Who'd never learned that reliability was an illusion maintained by people like him working in places like this to keep systems functional, despite age and budget cuts and management decisions that prioritized appearance over substance. The door opened onto a service corridor that ran parallel to the main ballroom. Through a narrow window he caught flashes of movement and light. Guests in formal wear clustered in small groups, their practiced smiles beginning to show strain. Security personnel spoke into radios with clipped urgency, trying to sound calm while searching for direction that wasn't coming because the people who should have been coordinating had never actually prepared for real emergencies. Only the theoretical kind discussed in meetings that assumed competence without testing it. Marcus moved along the corridor, checking panels as he went. The story they told was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. A temporary power draw from the gala's staging equipment had overloaded a section meant to handle half that demand. Someone had signed off on it anyway, approved the setup without doing the math, or checking the specifications, or caring about what happened when you pushed old wiring past its rated capacity. That kind of decision always came from above, from people insulated from consequences by layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. He made a quick adjustment, redistributing load just enough to prevent a full outage. Then keyed his radio. The transmission was brief, professional, devoid of emotion that might undermine the message. What mattered was information, not how he felt about management's incompetence or Kellerman's cost-cutting or the way systems failed when people in charge valued profit margins over safety margins. The reply came back distracted, rushed, barely acknowledging the warning. The voice on the other end had already moved on to the next item on a checklist that treated everything as equally important, which meant nothing was actually prioritized, and when the crisis came, they'd be caught flat-footed wondering why nobody saw it coming despite multiple warnings from someone who knew what he was talking about. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them again. Being unheard was nothing new. He'd spent 3 years becoming invisible, learning to accept that people saw what they expected to see and ignored everything else, especially expertise that came from sources they'd already dismissed based on appearance or position or assumptions about what maintenance workers could possibly know that executives didn't. He continued forward. The corridor ended near a set of double doors leading into the main ballroom. He stopped short of entering, taking in the scene through the glass. A man in a dress uniform stood near the stage, posture rigid, jaw tight, radiating authority in ways that had nothing to do with the medals on his chest and everything to do with decades spent in environments where authority meant the difference between order and chaos. Even without knowing his name, Marcus recognized the type. Career military, senior officer. Someone whose entire identity was built on structure and hierarchy, and the belief that rank meant something in rooms where everyone else deferred to it automatically. That was General Benjamin Hayes. Though Marcus didn't know the name yet, didn't know their paths would intersect in ways that stripped away carefully maintained anonymity and forced conversations he'd spent 3 years avoiding. For now, Hayes was just another element in a situation growing more unstable by the minute, another variable in calculations that kept adding up to disaster if someone didn't intervene before the whispers became screams. The gala had started 20 minutes ago. General Hayes's speech about service and sacrifice was scheduled for 9 o'clock. That gave Marcus 40 minutes to stabilize systems that shouldn't have been stressed this way in the first place, 40 minutes to prevent the kind of failure that made headlines and ended careers and got people hurt, through a combination of negligence and arrogance that Marcus had seen too many times in too many places to ever forgive. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. 8:20. Dylan would be finishing homework about now, maybe drawing another picture for the refrigerator gallery that had expanded to cover half the kitchen. Mrs. Callahan would make sure he brushed his teeth, took his inhaler, said his prayers that always included asking God to keep Daddy safe and bring him home like promised. The routine never varied. Consistency mattered when a 7-year-old had already lost one parent and needed to believe the other was permanent, reliable, the kind of certainty that survived late shifts and broken dates and nights, when Dad came home smelling like machine oil and exhaustion. Marcus pocketed the phone and returned his focus to the immediate problem. The ballroom's power consumption was creeping higher. He could see it in the way lights flickered at the edges of his vision. The way the air-handling system's hum carried subtle harmonics that indicated strain. Management wouldn't notice. Security wouldn't notice. The guests certainly wouldn't notice until the moment everything failed at once, and they found themselves in darkness wondering why nobody prevented something so obvious. But Marcus noticed. Marcus always noticed. That was the curse of expertise, seeing disasters before they happened and knowing nobody would listen until consequences made listening irrelevant. Because the time for prevention had passed and now everyone was in crisis mode, wondering why they didn't have better systems in place to avoid exactly the situation they were currently experiencing. He made his way back toward the main electrical room, the one that fed primary power to the ballroom and controlled the staging systems that some event coordinator had insisted on using despite warnings about load capacity. The door was locked, which meant Kellerman had been through here implementing his idiotic policy about restricting access to sensitive areas as if keeping people out. Improved security instead of creating bottlenecks when emergencies demanded immediate response. Marcus had keys. Maintenance always had keys even when management pretended otherwise. The lock clicked open. Inside the electrical room told the story management didn't want anyone to read. Temporary cables ran through conduits not rated for the amperage they carried. Junction boxes showed signs of overheating discolored insulation that screamed danger to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The whole setup was a violation waiting to happen, the kind of thing that kept insurance companies awake at night and resulted in lawsuits when inevitability converted potential energy into kinetic disaster. He pulled out his phone and started documenting. Photos of every violation, every substandard installation, every shortcut taken by contractors who'd been hired because they were cheap rather than competent. The pictures would matter later when investigations happened and people tried to spread blame instead of accepting responsibility. Marcus wanted a record, wanted evidence that someone had tried to warn them before everything went wrong, because he'd learned the hard way that memory was a poor defense against motivated denial. A clipboard hung near the door, maintenance logs that should have been updated daily but showed gaps spanning weeks. Someone had gotten lazy, skipped the routine checks, assumed everything was fine because nothing had exploded yet. Marcus flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for: the contractor authorization form for the temporary electrical work. The signature at the bottom belonged to Robert Kellerman, hotel general manager, approving work by a company called Midwest Value Electrical. Marcus pulled out his phone again and searched the name. The company's website was bare bones, no certifications listed. No licensed electricians on staff, just vague promises about competitive pricing and fast turnaround. He dug deeper, finding reviews that painted a picture of corner cutting and code violations and jobs that had to be redone by legitimate contractors after Midwest Value's work failed inspection. This was the company Kellerman had hired to handle electrical upgrades for a hotel hosting 300 people at a gala honoring military veterans. This was the decision that had turned the Riverside Grand into a disaster waiting for its moment. Marcus took a photo of the authorization form, then returned the clipboard to its hook. Evidence secured. Now came the harder part: deciding what to do with it. He could go to ownership directly, bypass Kellerman, present the documentation, and force an immediate shutdown of the gala before something catastrophic happened. That was the responsible choice, the one that prioritized safety over every other consideration. It was also the choice that ended his employment and blacklisted him from similar work in the hospitality industry, where managers protected each other and whistleblowers found themselves unemployable through quiet conversations and unofficial networks that made sure troublemakers never found steady work again. Marcus needed this job. Dylan needed the insurance that came with this job. Losing it meant losing access to the medications that kept his son breathing normally. The stability that let a 7-year-old sleep without nightmares. The fragile security that justified every compromise Marcus had made. To build a life that worked even if it meant accepting invisibility as the price of safety. He stood in the electrical room, surrounded by evidence of negligence that would probably kill someone tonight or tomorrow or whenever the overloaded systems finally gave up, and weighed his son's future against the lives of people who'd never know his name or care that he'd tried to warn them. It was an impossible choice, the kind that had no right answer, because every option demanded sacrifices that shouldn't be asked of someone whose only crime was knowing what others didn't, and caring enough to speak up despite consequences. The radio crackled again. Security checking in, reporting all clear, completely unaware that clear was a temporary condition lasting only until physics asserted itself over optimism and the laws governing electrical systems. reminded everyone why codes existed and what happened when profit mattered more than safety. Marcus listened to their confident voices and felt the familiar weight of knowing things others didn't. Seeing disasters before they happened, carrying responsibility for outcomes he couldn't control because the people with actual authority had already decided his expertise was less important than their convenience. He made his decision. He would monitor systems personally throughout the gala, stay close to override switches, prepare evacuation routes in his head, and hope the combination of vigilance and luck prevented the worst-case scenarios currently converging toward reality. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was the compromise between responsibility and survival, between protecting strangers and protecting Dylan, between being the man he'd been trained to be and being the father his son needed him to be. Every morning when small hands reached for him and a sleepy voice asked what they were having for breakfast, Marcus locked the electrical room behind him and headed toward the ballroom, staying in the service corridors, maintaining his invisibility even as every instinct screamed that someone needed to stop this before people died. The gala was beginning. General Hayes would take the stage soon. 300 guests would applaud and never know how close they were to disaster, how thin the margin was between the carefully orchestrated evening they expected and the chaos waiting to consume them the moment someone flipped one too many switches or pulled one too many amps through wiring that was already screaming in frequencies only Marcus could hear. He found a position near the service entrance, where he could monitor both the electrical panels and the ballroom itself, where he could respond quickly if systems failed, where he could watch everything fall apart and maybe, just maybe, keep people alive through a combination of skill and preparation and the particular brand of competence that came from places where failure meant death, and expertise meant the difference between going home and not going home ever again. The ballroom was filling now, formal wear and practiced smiles, conversations that sparkled with the kind of ease that came from lives insulated from real hardship. Victoria Sterling stood near the center of the room, commanding attention through sheer presence. Even though Marcus knew she was probably calculating every interaction, measuring each conversation against whatever metrics drove someone who'd built their identity around success and control and never appearing weak in spaces designed to punish vulnerability. She was talking to General Hayes, her posture perfect, her smile calibrated for maximum effect. Marcus watched through the narrow window and wondered what they were discussing. Whether contracts or strategy or the kind of networking that happened at events like this, where the real business happened in margins between speeches. He wondered if Victoria remembered the man she'd dismissed an hour ago, if she'd spared even a moment's thought for someone whose appearance didn't match her expectations, or if he'd already been filed away as forgettable, just another mistake in judgment that didn't matter because people like her didn't have to think about people like him once the interaction ended. The lights flickered again, more noticeably this time. A few guests glanced up, conversations pausing, then resuming when nothing else happened. Marcus's hand tightened on the radio. The whisper was getting louder. Soon it would be a shout. And then everyone would care, everyone would demand to know why nobody prevented this, why nobody saw it coming. Why the people responsible for safety had failed so completely to do the one job that actually mattered, when all the polish and planning couldn't overcome the fundamental reality that you couldn't push systems past their limits without eventually paying the price. He checked his phone one more time. A text from Mrs. Callahan. Dylan's asleep. Left the drawing on your pillow. See you in the morning. Marcus stared at the message, thought about his son, sleeping solely in their apartment while his father stood in a hotel that might burn tonight, that might collapse tonight, that might become the kind of tragedy people talked about for years, as an example of what happened when incompetence met negligence. And nobody with power cared enough to listen to warnings from sources they'd already dismissed. He thought about Dylan waking up tomorrow to news that his father hadn't come home. That promises meant nothing when buildings caught fire and systems failed, and the man who'd sworn to always return had died trying to save people who never knew his name. He put the phone away and focused on the panels on the readings that crept higher with each passing minute, on the disaster approaching with mechanical inevitability. While 300 people celebrated service and sacrifice without understanding they were about to experience both in ways none of them had volunteered for. The night was young, the crisis was coming, and Marcus Reed, invisible maintenance worker and former combat engineer, stood in the shadows preparing for the moment when everything he'd run from for 3 years would come roaring back and force him to choose between the life he'd built and the skills that defined who he'd been before loss taught him. The only mission worth dying for was the one sleeping Seeley at home, waiting for Dad to come back like he always did, like he always promised, like he had to keep doing. Because that was the one thing Dylan could count on in a world that had already taken too much. General Hayes reached the conclusion of his prepared remarks, voice carrying across the ballroom with the particular authority that came from decades commanding men in situations where words meant survival or death. Applause rippled through the crowd, polite but genuine, the kind reserved for speeches that touched something real beneath formality. Near the back of the room, Colonel Richard Moss began to rise from his chair. One hand gripping the table for support, the other clutching a cane that had become necessary after age and service had extracted their combined toll on joints and balance. Marcus saw it happen through the service entrance window. The way Moss's face went gray, the way his grip loosened on surfaces that suddenly couldn't hold him. The way his body forgot how to stay upright and gravity became the only force that mattered. The collision with the floor carried the specific sound of meat and bone hitting marble, the sound Marcus had heard before in places where falling meant something worse than embarrassment, and nobody laughed because everyone understood how quickly bodies stopped working when systems failed. The ballroom froze in that particular way crowds do when something goes wrong in public, everyone uncertain whether to help or look away, whether intervention would be welcomed or intrusive, whether someone else was already handling the situation so they could remain comfortable in their seats and let professionals deal with unpleasantness that interrupted carefully orchestrated evenings. Moss lay on his side, not moving, chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm that preceded cardiac arrest when hearts decided they'd worked long enough and the warranty expired without warning. Marcus didn't think. Thinking wasted seconds Moss didn't have. The service door opened under his palm hinges, designed for silence so staff could move through spaces without disturbing guests, who paid premium rates to never see the machinery that kept their comfort functioning. His boots found marble cross-distance, measured in heartbeats rather than steps, dropped him to one knee, beside a man whose pulse was already fading into the kind of nothing that became permanent if someone didn't intervene in the narrow window between crisis and casualty. Victoria Sterling stood 3 feet away, phone in hand, paralyzed by the specific helplessness that came when competence meant nothing, because the skills that mattered in boardrooms couldn't restart hearts or clear airways or make bodies obey commands they'd stopped following. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing sound. Around her, other guests remained frozen, waiting for someone to fix the situation so they could return to their drinks and conversations, and the carefully maintained illusion that bad things happened elsewhere to other people. Marcus's hands moved through assessments drilled so deeply into muscle memory that conscious thought was optional. Airway clear, breathing inadequate, circulation failing. The steps unfolded automatically, procedures learned in classrooms where instructors used words like golden hour and preventable death, and explained why hesitation killed more people than ignorance ever did. Colonel Moss's chest felt hollow under his palm ribs, more fragile than they should be. the architecture of age and service collapsing inward under compressions that had to be hard enough to circulate blood but gentle enough to avoid snapping bones that would puncture lungs and convert one emergency into two. His voice cut through the silence with specific authority that bypassed doubt and triggered compliance in people trained to recognize command when they heard it. The words were simple, direct, absent of anything that might be mistaken for request or suggestion. Nearby faces turned toward him, some registering confusion that maintenance staff was speaking with such certainty. Others responding to tone before processing content. Because authority was authority regardless of who carried it or what uniform they wore when exercising it. General Hayes materialized at the edge of Marcus's peripheral vision, drawn by the disruption and held by something in how the man kneeling beside Moss moved with practiced efficiency that suggested training beyond anything hotels taught their maintenance crews. Hayes had spent 40 years around military personnel, knew how they carried themselves under pressure. Recognized the particular economy of motion that came from environments where wasted movement meant wasted lives. Something about this situation felt familiar in ways Hayes couldn't name yet, but registered nonetheless in instincts honed through decades of command. Marcus counted compressions maintained. Rhythm ignored everything except the immediate problem of keeping blood moving through vessels that had stopped circulating on their own. Moss's color was wrong, the gray deepening toward blue, the transition that marked oxygen debt accumulating toward permanent damage. Time compressed into heartbeats, each one measured by Marcus's hands against a chest that refused to restart on its own. That required external force to maintain the minimum function necessary to prevent brain death, while someone located the equipment that might shock muscle back into coordinated contraction. The security guard returned carrying a yellow box marked with lightning bolts and stick figures demonstrating proper pad placement. Marcus took it without looking up, broke the seal, powered the device while maintaining compressions with one hand. In the kind of multitasking that came from practice nobody acquired in peaceful circumstances. The automated voice began its instructions calm and mechanical, designed to walk untrained bystanders through procedures Marcus could perform in his sleep, because he'd done it dozens of times in places where AEDs didn't exist. And improvisation meant the difference between saving someone and watching them die. He positioned the pads with precision that spoke to familiarity beyond casual training. The AED analyzed rhythm, found something salvageable, charged its capacitor while announcing shock, advised in the bland tone programmed to avoid panic. Marcus cleared the immediate space with a glance that made people step back without conscious decision, placed his hands on surfaces the electrical current wouldn't travel through, pressed the orange button that sent voltage through Moss's chest in controlled violence, meant to reset circuits that had fallen out of sync. Moss's body convulsed, once muscles contracting in ways they weren't designed to, then relaxed back into stillness. That might be death, or might be the temporary pause before life decided whether to continue. The AED resumed analysis, declared rhythm restored, instructed to continue monitoring. Marcus checked pulse manually, found something present but thready, good enough for now, good enough until paramedics arrived with equipment and medications that exceeded what a maintenance worker should have access to in civilian settings. He looked up and found General Hayes watching with expression that combined assessment with growing recognition, the kind that preceded questions Marcus didn't want to answer. Their eyes met briefly, long enough for Hayes to register something familiar in how Marcus carried himself, how he'd moved through the emergency with practiced calm. That suggested this wasn't his first cardiac arrest, wasn't even his 10th. That somewhere in his history was training that explained competence beyond what job description or appearance indicated. Before Hayes could speak, Marcus was already standing, already turning toward the veteran whose life he'd just extended, already deflecting attention in ways that had become automatic over 3 years of deliberate invisibility. The ballroom had started breathing again, conversations resuming in lowered voices, crisis contained enough that people could return to their comfort zones and file the incident underhandled rather than catastrophic. Marcus melted back toward the service entrance, feet carrying him away from recognition before questions could form and destroy the careful anonymity that protected everything he'd built since deciding fatherhood mattered more than any other identity. Hayes took 2 steps forward, voice carrying just far enough to reach Marcus before the service door cleared. The question was simple, direct, the kind that demanded answer even when silence would be safer. Marcus paused at the threshold, spine straight, shoulders level, presenting the kind of bearing Hayes had seen 10,000 times in 10,000 subordinates who'd learned how to stand at attention even when circumstances didn't require it. The answer came carefully measured, providing minimum information necessary, while avoiding anything that might invite follow-up or deeper inquiry into qualifications that would raise questions about how a facility's maintenance technician knew advanced life support procedures and moved through medical emergencies like someone who'd done it professionally. Hayes absorbed the response without immediate reaction, filing it somewhere in the mental catalog where observations went, when they didn't quite fit available data, but seemed important nonetheless. Marcus didn't wait for further conversation. The service door closed behind him, cutting off the ballroom's warmth and light, returning him to corridors where nobody questioned who he was or what he knew. Because these were spaces designed for people who worked rather than people who watched. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline dump arriving after action rather than during it. Body processing stress once immediate danger had passed, and consciousness had bandwidth to acknowledge how close Moss had come to dying on marble floors while 300 people stood around waiting for someone else to fix it. He leaned against the wall, taking 3 slow breaths that were supposed to calm his heart rate, but mostly just reminded him how tired he was, how the day had started with humiliation and evolved into life or death decisions and still wasn't over, because the electrical systems he'd been monitoring were approaching critical thresholds that nobody upstairs cared about until failure made caring mandatory. The radio at his belt crackled with routine check-ins, security personnel reporting all clear from posts around the hotel, completely unaware that clear was temporary and crisis was still approaching with mechanical certainty. He checked his phone. 8:43. Dylan would be asleep by now. Small body curled around the stuffed elephant that had belonged to Elise and still carried faint traces of her perfume, even after 3 years of washing and hugging and serving as security blanket against nightmares about loss. Mrs. Callahan would be reading in the living room, keeping watch until Marcus came home, because she'd known them since Dylan was born, and had appointed herself unofficial grandmother to a boy who needed family, even if it wasn't blood. Marcus typed a quick message. Rough night. Going to be late. Make sure his inhaler is on the nightstand. The response came immediately. Already there. You okay? The question was harder to answer than it should be. He settled for managing. Thanks for everything. You're a good father, Marcus. Elise would be proud. The words hit harder than they should, opening spaces he usually kept closed during work hours when staying functional meant not thinking about all the things Elise would never see, all the moments she'd miss, all the ways Dylan would grow up without his mother because sometimes bodies failed and medicine couldn't fix it. And loving someone didn't protect them from dying anyway. He pocketed the phone before sentiment could overwhelm discipline, before the weight of single parenthood could paralyze him when the building needed his attention, and 300 people depended on systems staying functional, even if they didn't know it. The lights flickered again longer this time, dimming toward complete failure before recovering with the kind of reluctance that indicated reserves depleting faster than anyone upstairs wanted to acknowledge. Marcus pushed off the wall and moved toward the main electrical room at pace that suggested urgency without broadcasting panic. The situation was deteriorating on schedule following the trajectory he'd predicted, based on load calculations and stressed systems and the fundamental reality that you couldn't push infrastructure past design limits without eventually triggering cascade failure. Inside the electrical room, the evidence was impossible to ignore for anyone who knew what they were looking at. Temperature gauges showed red. Voltage fluctuations had moved from occasional to constant. The smell of overheating insulation carried the specific chemical signature that preceded fires when wiring exceeded thermal limits and protective coatings broke down under sustained abuse. Marcus ran quick calculations in his head, weighing options that ranged from immediate shutdown to carefully managed power reduction that might buy enough time to finish the gala before catastrophe struck. The choice was stolen from him by physics asserting itself over optimism. Main power failed with the suddenness that characterized total system collapse, the kind where cascading problems reached critical mass, and every circuit breaker decided simultaneously that continuing to function would cause more damage than stopping. The electrical room went dark except for battery-powered emergency lights that cast everything in sickly green glow designed to prevent panic while providing minimum visibility for essential operations. His radio exploded with voices, security and staff and management all trying to understand what had happened and who was responsible and what the plan was for restoring normalcy to an event that had just transitioned from carefully controlled to barely contained chaos. Marcus ignored them, focusing on the panels that would tell him how bad the damage was and whether restoration was possible or if the building's electrical infrastructure had just suffered failure requiring days of repair work and professional contractors who actually knew what they were doing. The assessment took 90 seconds. Long enough to confirm his worst fears, short enough that he could still intervene before the situation degraded from crisis to catastrophe. The main feed was intact, but the distribution system had failed at multiple junction points. Overwhelmed by load it was never designed to carry, he could reroute through secondary systems, provide emergency lighting and minimum HVAC, but full restoration would require repairs beyond what he could accomplish during a gala with 300 people trapped in darkness wondering why the hotel couldn't keep the lights on. Footsteps approached from the corridor, angry and purposeful. The particular cadence of someone looking for someone else to blame for problems they'd created through incompetence and arrogance. Robert Kellerman burst through the doorway, face flushed, tie loosened every gesture, screaming rage, looking for target. His voice preceded understanding accusations flying before he'd even processed what Marcus was doing or what the panels indicated about who was actually responsible for the failure everyone upstairs was currently experiencing. Marcus didn't look up from the board, hands moving through reconfigurations that required fuse and precision that emotional outbursts couldn't interrupt. His response was flat, absent of anything that might be mistaken for apology or acceptance of blame. Being projected toward him by someone whose decisions had created this situation, and who lacked either the integrity to acknowledge responsibility or the expertise to understand what was actually happening beyond. Lights going out during his carefully planned event. Kellerman's accusations escalated, incorporating threats about termination and lawsuits and making sure Marcus never worked in hospitality again. The standard arsenal of weapons weak men deployed when competence challenged their authority. And they had nothing left except hierarchy and promised consequences that might or might not materialize depending on whether reality aligned with their narratives. Marcus continued working, routing power through systems designed for different purposes, sacrificing non-essential functions to maintain life safety equipment. and exit lighting that would prevent panic from becoming stampede. The ultimatum came wrapped in certainty that Marcus would comply, because subordinates always complied when management spoke, and the alternative was unemployment and loss of everything he'd worked to build. Kellerman's voice carried that particular smugness that came from never having experienced real consequences, never having been in situations where decisions mattered beyond quarterly reports and customer satisfaction scores, never having seen what happened when incompetence met disaster. And people died because someone prioritized ego over expertise. Marcus stopped working, turned, met Kellerman's eyes with expression that carried weight accumulated from places Kellerman couldn't imagine and wouldn't survive if he found himself there. The words were quiet, controlled, absent of inflection that might suggest negotiation was possible, or that Marcus gave a damn about threats from someone whose authority was purely procedural, and meant nothing when measured against the immediate requirement of keeping people alive through a crisis that person had created. The response was simple, direct, devastating in its complete dismissal of everything Kellerman represented. Fire me tomorrow if you need someone to blame. Tonight I'm going to keep people from dying in your hotel. Now get out of my way before you make this worse. Kellerman's mouth worked, processing rejection of hierarchy that wasn't supposed to be possible, that violated every assumption about how relationships worked between management and maintenance staff. His face cycled through colors, settling on red that suggested either apoplexy or the beginning of understanding that some situations transcended organizational charts. And in those moments, competence mattered more than title. He left without further comment, footsteps retreating down the corridor in pattern that suggested wounded dignity searching for somewhere safe to nurse itself. Marcus returned to the panel, rerouting final connections that would restore minimum lighting to the ballroom and hallways, enough to prevent panic, while he figured out whether the building could sustain even reduced load, or if total shutdown was the only option. The work required 10 minutes of focused effort, 10 minutes during which anything could happen upstairs. 10 minutes he couldn't spare but had to invest, because half measures in electrical work killed people more reliably than bullets ever did. Upstairs, the ballroom had descended into controlled chaos. Emergency lighting provided enough illumination to prevent stampede, but not enough to restore normalcy or convince guests that everything was under control and they should remain seated while staff addressed the situation. Conversations had that particular edge that preceded panic, voices rising in volume as people demanded answers nobody could provide, because the person who actually understood what was happening was 3 floors down. Rewiring systems in ways that violated every code and safety standard but might prevent the building from burning down. Victoria Sterling found herself moving without conscious decision, responding to crisis in ways her corporate training had never prepared her for, but that aligned with something deeper than professional competence. Elderly veterans were struggling to navigate in reduced lighting. Some disoriented, others frightened in ways that suggested the darkness triggered memories of situations where darkness meant danger and threat and the possibility of dying before sunrise. She began organizing them, speaking in calm tones that borrowed authority from crisis rather than position, directing them toward exits that glowed softly in emergency lighting, designed to prevent exactly the kind of panic that would get people killed. General Hayes had taken position near the stage, using his command presence to maintain order in room that wanted to dissolve into individual panic, but responded to authority figure projecting confidence even when the situation didn't justify it. His orders were clear, specific, designed to give people concrete actions instead of leaving them paralyzed by uncertainty. Stay calm, move slowly toward exits, follow staff instructions. The message repeated in variations that kept people focused on immediate steps rather than hypothetical disasters their imaginations wanted to construct. Through the narrow window of the service corridor, Victoria caught glimpses of Marcus working in the electrical room, hands moving with purpose through tasks she didn't understand but recognized as essential. The man she'd dismissed 2 hours ago was currently the only reason 300 people weren't trapped in complete darkness wondering if the building was on fire and they were about to die in catastrophe that could have been prevented if someone in authority had listened to warnings from sources they'd already decided didn't matter. The realization hit with force that nearly staggered her. She'd judged him by appearance, dismissed his competence based on clothing and job title, and assumptions about who mattered in spaces designed to celebrate people like her while rendering invisible people like him. He'd absorbed her contempt without protest, finished his drink, left the lounge, and then spent the evening working to prevent disaster. She'd contributed to through indifference to infrastructure she'd never thought about. Because it always worked and someone else was responsible for making sure it continued working. Marcus emerged from the electrical room and headed toward the ballroom, moving through corridors with practiced efficiency that suggested familiarity beyond casual employment. Victoria watched him enter through the service door, scanning the room with expression that combined assessment with calculation, identifying problems and formulating solutions while everyone else was still processing that something had gone wrong. His voice carried across the space when he spoke, not loud but clear, projecting authority that made people listen despite having no official role in the emergency unfolding around them. The instructions were specific, actionable, designed to move people safely without triggering panic that would make orderly evacuation impossible. Elderly and mobility limited toward the north exit where staff could provide assistance. Everyone else through west stairwell in controlled groups that wouldn't overwhelm capacity or create bottlenecks where crushing became real possibility. No elevators under any circumstances, because elevator shafts were death traps during building failures, and people who ignored that warning began statistics. Victoria found herself following his instructions, organizing groups, maintaining calm through combination of presence and specific direction that gave people something to focus on besides their fear. She worked alongside security personnel who deferred to her because she projected confidence, even though she had no more training for this situation than they did. The difference was she'd spent the last hour watching Marcus work and absorbing through observation how competence operated under pressure. How authority derived from expertise rather than position, how leadership meant making decisions that prioritized outcomes over ego. The evacuation proceeded with efficiency that surprised everyone except Marcus, who'd planned for exactly this scenario and positioned resources in advance. Because preparation was the difference between controlled crisis and catastrophic failure. Groups moved through exits in steady stream, elderly veterans supported by younger guests who'd found purpose in helping others instead of focusing on their own discomfort. The ballroom emptied in 15 minutes faster than anyone had right to expect, given the circumstances and the demographic skewing elderly with mobility challenges. Marcus remained at the bottleneck point near the west stairwell, directing traffic with gestures that required no verbal reinforcement, making instant decisions about who went through which exit, based on factors only he was tracking, because everyone else was too focused on their immediate situation to process the larger pattern. Victoria watched him work and understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't improvisation, wasn't luck, wasn't someone rising to the occasion through accident of circumstance. This was expertise deployed by someone who'd done this before in places where the stakes were higher and the consequences of failure were measured in body counts. The lights flickered again, dimmer now, reserves depleting toward complete failure. Marcus's expression tightened fractionally, only signal that something was wrong beyond what everyone could already see. He keyed his radio, speaking in shorthand that security wouldn't understand, but that conveyed urgency to anyone trained to decode compressed communication designed for situations where bandwidth was limited and clarity was survival. Smoke began filtering through ventilation systems, thin at first, then thicker, carrying the specific smell of electrical fire where insulation burns and creates toxic compounds that kill through inhalation before flames ever reach you. The situation had escalated from power failure to active emergency, from inconvenience to legitimate threat, from something that could be managed to something that required immediate evacuation before the building became uninhabitable or worse. Marcus shifted priorities, instantly abandoning carefully controlled evacuation in favor of getting everyone out now, through whatever route was fastest. His voice carried new edge command rather than suggestion, authority that transcended his position because survival didn't care about organizational charts. And when buildings burned, the person who knew how they worked mattered more than anyone who signed paychecks. The message was simple: move. Faster, stay low. Exit the building immediately through any available route. Don't stop for belongings or comfort or anything except getting outside before smoke became toxic and fire became inferno. General Hayes appeared at Marcus's elbow, asking what was needed, offering assistance without question or doubt, because 40 years of command had taught him to recognize competence and defer to expertise when someone clearly knew what they were doing. Marcus gave him specific tasks, directing Hayes to clear the north corridor and make sure no one remained in back rooms where they might be forgotten during evacuation that was rapidly devolving from organized to desperate. Hayes moved without hesitation, gathering security personnel and directing them with same authority he'd used, commanding battalions, voice cutting through chaos with certainty that made people respond before they'd consciously processed his instructions. Within 5 minutes, the main floor was clear, everyone either outside or in stairwells heading toward exits accounted for and moving in directions that led away from smoke and fire. And the increasing possibility that the Riverside Grand was about to become headline news for all the wrong reasons. Marcus did a final sweep of the ballroom, checking behind curtains and under tables and in all the spaces where people might hide during panic or collapse during medical emergency. The room was empty except for abandoned purses and phones and the detritus of interrupted celebration, evidence of how quickly normalcy could fracture when systems failed and comfort became liability. He turned toward the exit, satisfied everyone was clear, and stopped when radio traffic indicated problem on second floor, where some elderly veterans had become separated from main group and needed assistance reaching exits through smoke that was thicker there because heat rose and carried toxins upward into spaces people thought were safer because they were farther from ground floor. The decision required no conscious thought. He redirected toward stairs leading upward toward danger everyone else was fleeing, toward situation that violated every survival instinct except the one that insisted no man left behind was more than slogan, was code. That survived transition from military to civilian life. Because some values transcended context, and abandoning people to save yourself was moral failure regardless of whether uniforms or rank made it official. The second floor hallway was visibility near zero. Smoke thick enough that breathing required shirt pressed over face, and movement meant feeling along walls. Because sight was useless in conditions designed to make rescue impossible. Marcus's training asserted itself over circumstances, procedures drilled so deeply that conscious thought was optional when muscle memory and practice could navigate situations that would paralyze people who'd never had reason to prepare for buildings trying to kill them. Voices called from somewhere ahead, elderly and frightened, asking if someone was coming, if help was real. If they were going to die here, forgotten while everyone else escaped to safety. Marcus followed sound through darkness, hands. Finding doorframe that led into conference room where 3 veterans huddled near windows that wouldn't open. Because modern buildings sealed occupants inside for climate control and energy efficiency. Without considering what happened when inside became death trap. The oldest among them was Colonel Bennett, wheelchair-bound, unable to navigate stairs without assistance that hadn't arrived when evacuation began because procedures assumed everyone could self-evacuate and forgot that age and injury created limitations that transformed crisis into catastrophe. Marcus assessed situation in seconds. 3 men, 1 wheelchair, smoke getting thicker stairs, the only exit because elevators were death and windows were sealed, and remaining here meant dying when fire reached this floor and consumed everything combustible, including people who'd stayed put waiting for rescue. He gave them instructions, clear and direct, no room for negotiation or doubt. Bennett in the wheelchair would be carried by Marcus. The other 2 would follow, hands on Marcus's shoulders, maintaining contact, so no one got separated in smoke that was now thick enough that visibility was measured in inches. They would move slowly but steadily toward stairs, descend 1 level, exit through north corridor that should still be clear. Questions were forbidden, compliance was mandatory, hesitation was death. Bennett protested weakly, arguing his weight made him burden that would slow everyone down. That Marcus should take the mobile veterans and leave him because saving 2 was better than risking all 4 by trying to move someone who couldn't walk. The protest was brave and stupid and based on calculus that worked in theory but ignored that Marcus hadn't come up here to perform triage. Hadn't made the choice to enter burning buildings so he could pick favorites and leave the rest, had spent 10 years in profession where you brought everyone home or you failed, and failure meant living with the knowledge that someone died because you'd made calculations about whose life mattered more. His response was short, final, absent of anything that invited debate. We all go together or we all stay here. Your choice, Colonel, but make it fast because this building is trying to kill us and I'd prefer not to let it. Bennett nodded, understanding in his eyes that suggested he recognized authority that came from places where decisions like this were routine and arguments about worth were luxuries nobody could afford. Marcus positioned himself, lifted Bennett from wheelchair with mechanics that prevented back injury while maintaining balance in conditions where falling meant failing, meant losing everyone because one mistake would cascade into catastrophe that made news and destroyed lives and proved critics right. Who'd said Marcus Reed should have stayed invisible instead of trying to be hero? Movement through smoke required faith. That procedure worked when senses provided no useful data. Marcus counted steps, tracked direction changes, maintained contact with walls that guided them toward stairwell that should still be clear but might already be compromised by fire spreading further than anyone had planned for because fires never consulted timelines and buildings burned at rates determined by fuel load and ventilation rather than human convenience. The 2 mobile veterans maintained contact, hands gripping Marcus's shoulders hard enough to hurt, hard enough to provide certainty they were still together even when visibility was nothing and sound was unreliable because smoke played tricks with acoustics. The stairwell appeared exactly where Marcus's count suggested it should be. Door marked by exit sign glowing weakly through haze that reduced everything to shapes without detail. He checked temperature with back of hand. Before opening, confirming the door wasn't super hot and the stairwell hadn't become chimney funneling flames upward. Cool enough. He opened door carefully, checking for smoke or heat that would indicate stairwell was compromised. Clear. They descended in formation that moved slowly but never stopped, never hesitated, maintained steady pace that got them down 1 floor and through door into north corridor that was clearer than hallways they'd left behind. General haze materialized from smoke like apparition, flanked by firefighters whose arrival Marcus hadn't noticed, because he'd been focused on things more immediate than whether help was coming or whether rescue would require self-sufficiency. Hayes took charge of the mobile veterans, directing them toward exits, while firefighters relieved Marcus of Bennett's weight and carried him toward safety with efficiency that came from professional training and equipment designed specifically for situations like this. Marcus stood in corridor, breathing air that was clearer but still toxic, processing the fact that everyone was safe and the building hadn't killed them despite best efforts. And somewhere in the chaos, he'd crossed line between invisible maintenance worker and person who did things worth noticing. Hayes was watching him with expression that combined relief with calculation recognition, dawning that the man who'd saved Moss's life and directed evacuations and just carried 3 veterans through smoke was someone worth knowing more about than name and job title suggested. Before Hayes could speak, Marcus was moving again, heading back toward electrical room because fire was contained but not extinguished and systems were still unstable, and his job wasn't finished just because people were safe. Celebration could wait. Analysis could wait. Questions about who he was and where he'd learned to function like this could wait. Right now, the building needed someone who understood its bones and could keep it from collapsing, while firefighters dealt with flames and paramedics dealt with casualties and everyone else dealt with shock of evening that had fractured beyond repair. The electrical room showed damage that would require days to fix properly, weeks to bring everything up to code, months to address all the violations that Kellerman's corner cutting had created. Marcus documented everything with phone camera, capturing evidence that would matter when investigations happened and blame was distributed, and insurance companies tried to determine liability for disaster that never should have happened if people in authority had listened to warnings from sources they'd dismissed as inconvenient. He worked through the night stabilizing what could be stabilized, shutting down what couldn't, marking systems as hazardous, so contractors wouldn't electrocute themselves trying to restore power without understanding which circuits were safe and which ones were traps waiting to kill. The work was methodical, solitary, exactly the kind of task Marcus had spent 3 years convincing himself was enough. All he needed was sufficient contribution to justify existence that had become smaller and quieter and more carefully controlled with each passing month. Outside, dawn approached with the specific quality of light that followed disasters when exhaustion made everything surreal and perspective shifted. Because normal had shattered and couldn't be reassembled from fragments scattered across night that felt like it would never end. Marcus emerged from the building to find General Hayes waiting near the service entrance, posture suggesting he'd been standing there a while, that waiting was choice rather than accident. Their conversation was brief. Hayes asking questions, Marcus answered with minimum detail necessary, providing name and position and nothing else. Because more information meant more questions, and questions led places Marcus had spent 3 years avoiding. Hayes listened with attention that suggested he heard things beyond words, patterns in how Marcus spoke and moved and carried himself that triggered recognition Hayes couldn't quite place but knew mattered in ways that would become clear when he had time to think instead of react. The night was ending, but the story wasn't finished. Wasn't even close to resolution, because what happened next would determine whether Marcus's careful invisibility survived crisis, or whether saving people meant exposing himself in ways that couldn't be undone and forced confrontation with past. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget while building future that required everyone to forget he'd ever been anyone except the quiet maintenance worker who kept buildings functional and never caused problems and remained safely invisible to people who might ask questions he didn't want to answer. The sun broke over Chicago's skyline with the particular quality that followed sleepless nights' light, arriving as proof that time continued despite everything that had fractured in darkness. Marcus stood near the service entrance, shoulders carrying weight that had nothing to do with Colonel Bennett, or smoke inhalation, or the physical toll of hours spent navigating crisis. The weight was older, accumulated across 3 years of deliberate invisibility, now stripped away. Because saving people meant being seen, and being seen meant answering questions he'd spent considerable effort avoiding. General Hayes approached with purpose that suggested this wasn't casual conversation, wasn't chance encounter between 2 people who happened to be outside at dawn. His eyes held assessment that went beyond gratitude, recognition forming from patterns he'd observed throughout the night, pieces assembling into conclusion that Marcus could see coming and couldn't prevent without walking away right now. and never returning, which would solve nothing because Hayes was the kind of man who investigated inconsistencies and wouldn't let this drop until satisfaction replaced curiosity. The question came direct, absent of preamble that might soften its impact. Where did you learn to do what you did tonight? The words were simple, but the weight behind them suggested Hayes already knew the answer's shape was just confirming details that instinct had provided when watching Marcus work through emergencies with competence that transcended civilian training. Marcus could have deflected, could have offered vague responses about first aid courses and on-the-job experience, could have maintained the careful fiction that maintenance workers naturally knew advanced life support and building evacuation, and how to carry wheelchair-bound veterans through smoke without panicking. The lie would have been thin enough to tear under minimal scrutiny, but might have bought time to disappear before deeper investigation revealed truths that carried consequences Marcus had spent 3 years insulating Dylan from experiencing. But standing there in dawn light with body too exhausted for sustained deception, and mind too tired to maintain careful distance between past and present, Marcus made different choice. The truth came measured in minimum detail, necessary, providing framework without specifics, confirming Hayes's suspicions without offering ammunition for questions that would require answers Marcus wasn't willing to give about places he'd been and things he'd done when wearing different uniform and answering to different authority: Army, combat engineer, EOD specialist, 10 years, staff sergeant, honorable discharge. The information arrived as data points rather than story facts stripped of context that might invite emotional response or deeper inquiry into why someone with that background was working maintenance at hotel and living invisibly when skills like his typically translated into careers that offered better compensation and public recognition. Hayes absorbed each piece, face registering nothing except attention that suggested processing beyond what words explicitly conveyed. The follow-up was inevitable. Why maintenance? Why here? Why deliberately underemployed when defense contractors paid premium rates for expertise Marcus had demonstrated throughout the night? Hayes didn't phrase it as judgment, just genuine curiosity about decision that seemed irrational from outside perspective, that measured worth in income and title and visible markers of success that Marcus had abandoned when choosing invisibility over advancement. Marcus looked toward parking lot where emergency vehicles were departing, crisis contained enough that professional responders could return to stations and wait for next disaster. His voice carried weight accumulated from hospital corridors 3 years ago, when nurse handed him infant son and explained his wife wouldn't be coming home, because sometimes medicine failed and love wasn't enough to keep people alive. When bodies decided to stop functioning. I have a 7-year-old son. He needs stability more than I need career advancement. This job lets me be home for breakfast and bedtime. That matters more than money or recognition or anything else people measure success by. The answer landed with finality that foreclosed debate, establishing boundary. Hayes respected even as calculation continued behind eyes that had spent decades evaluating personnel and recognizing when someone's stated reasoning aligned with deeper truth. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that transcended words. Because both men had made sacrifices for causes beyond themselves and knew that hierarchy of values looked different when measured against what mattered most rather than what impressed others. Victoria Sterling had been standing near enough to overhear, positioned where dawn light cast her shadow toward them, but didn't quite reach her face. She'd arrived during Marcus's explanation, drawn by need to understand the man she'd dismissed based on appearance, and was now discovering operated according to principles that challenged every assumption she'd constructed about worth and competence, and who deserved respect in spaces designed to celebrate people like her while rendering invisible people like him. Her presence registered in Marcus's peripheral vision, but he didn't acknowledge. It didn't shift attention from Hayes to address woman who'd laughed him out of executive lounge hours before this night had fractured into chaos that proved exactly how wrong her judgment had been. Victoria absorbed this dismissal without protest, recognizing it as consequence she'd earned through behavior that now felt inexcusable in light of everything that followed. Hayes' extended hand grip firm but not crushing, contact brief but genuine in ways that suggested respect rather than performance. "Thank you for what you did tonight. You saved lives, prevented catastrophe, demonstrated leadership that honored your service and everything it represents." Marcus accepted the handshake, released it, stepped back to re-establish distance that Hayes was trying to close through gratitude that felt too much like recognition Marcus didn't want. His response was automatic, deflecting praise towards circumstances rather than accepting it as reflection of character or skill. "I did what needed doing. Anyone with proper training would have done the same." The false humility irritated Hayes in ways his expression couldn't quite hide. "No, not anyone. You moved through crisis with competence that comes from experience most people never acquire and wouldn't survive if they did. That matters whether you acknowledge it or not." Before Marcus could respond, hotel ownership emerged from main entrance, flanked by fire marshal and insurance investigators, whose presence indicated that accountability phase had begun and someone would pay for disaster that never should have happened if people in authority had listened to warnings from sources they deemed unworthy of serious consideration. The owner recognized Marcus, immediately approached with expression combining relief and calculation, gratitude mixed with awareness that this particular maintenance worker now possessed documentation and testimony that could destroy hotel's reputation if handled incorrectly. The conversation was brief, professional, transactional in ways that made clear this was negotiation rather than simple thanks. Kellerman had been terminated effective immediately, his negligence too blatant to defend and too well documented to deny. The contractor authorization forms bore his signature. The cost-cutting directives came from his office. The ignored warnings were logged in Marcus's reports. Every thread led back to decisions prioritizing profit over safety, convenience over code compliance, appearance over reality, that buildings required maintenance by competent professionals rather than cheapest available option. The owner offered Marcus promotion to Director of Safety and Facilities, substantial raise, authority to implement whatever changes he deemed necessary to prevent recurrence of tonight's near catastrophe. The offer was generous by any metric, recognition that Marcus's expertise was asset worth retaining, and that losing him to competitor or lawsuit would compound disaster into catastrophe that destroyed hotel's reputation beyond repair. Marcus listened without interruption, face revealing nothing about whether the offer interested him or meant anything beyond confirmation that crisis had temporarily inverted hierarchy and given him leverage he'd never sought and didn't particularly want. When the owner finished, Marcus requested time to consider, deflecting immediate decision in favor of space. To think without audience and pressure that came from people watching, to see how invisible maintenance worker responded to sudden visibility and opportunity to transform circumstances through acceptance of recognition he'd spent 3 years avoiding. The owner agreed, providing contact information and emphasizing that offer remained open, as long as Marcus needed to decide that hotel valued his expertise and wanted to retain him regardless of title or compensation structure. The message was clear: name your price, accept. Promotion, stay where management could control narrative and prevent his departure from becoming story about how hotel mistreated the man who'd saved everyone when systems failed and incompetence nearly killed 300 people. Marcus pocketed the business card without comment. neither accepting nor refusing, maintaining ambiguity that prevented commitment while preserving option to decline if that served Dylan better than advancement that came with visibility. Marcus had deliberately rejected when choosing fatherhood over career that demanded more than he could give while still being present for 7-year-old, who needed him more than buildings needed another facilities director. The gathering dispersed as dawn fully established itself. Emergency responders departing, hotel staff beginning damage assessment, guests who'd been displaced finding transportation to other accommodations, while Riverside Grand underwent repairs that would take weeks and cost more than Kellerman's cost-cutting had ever saved. Marcus remained near service entrance, exhaustion finally asserting itself now that adrenaline had depleted and body was demanding rest it hadn't received in 20 hours of continuous crisis management. Victoria approached from his blindside footsteps, deliberate enough to announce presence without startling him. Her voice carried different quality than it had in executive lounge armor stripped away to reveal something more human beneath polish. That usually concealed vulnerability she'd learned to hide in spaces that punished any display of weakness or uncertainty. The words came slowly, carefully chosen, absent of justification or excuse that might dilute apology she owed for judgment that had been wrong in every way that mattered. I need to say something. You don't have to respond, don't owe me anything, but I need you to hear this because what I did was inexcusable and you deserve acknowledgement that I was completely wrong about you. Marcus turned, meeting her eyes with expression that combined exhaustion with curiosity about where this was heading and whether it represented genuine remorse or damage control from someone whose professional reputation might suffer if people learned she'd dismissed the man who'd saved them all. He didn't speak, didn't encourage or discourage, just waited to hear what Victoria Sterling thought was worth saying after the night had conclusively demonstrated everything her initial judgment had missed. The confession came raw, stripped of corporate speak that usually insulated her from authentic emotion. She'd judged him by appearance, dismissed his worth based on clothing and job title and assumptions about who mattered in spaces designed to celebrate people like her. She'd been cruel not from malice but from armor she'd constructed after divorce that taught her to measure everyone by surfaces because trusting depth had ended with betrayal that made her question every judgment she'd ever made about character and worth. Tonight had shattered that armor, revealed how thoroughly wrong she'd been, demonstrated that the man she'd laughed out of a lounge possessed competence and courage and leadership that everyone upstairs had needed when crisis arrived, and comfortable assumptions about who had value proved catastrophically inadequate. She'd watched him work, seen how he moved through emergency with expertise that saved lives, recognized too late that she'd become everything she'd hated about people who'd underestimated her, and was now standing in wreckage of her own judgment, asking for nothing except acknowledgement that she understood how badly she'd failed basic human decency. Marcus absorbed this without visible reaction, processing apology that seemed genuine, but arrived too late to undo harm that had been minor compared to everything else that night had demanded. His response was measured, neither accepting nor rejecting her contrition, just acknowledging that she wasn't alone in judging poorly, and that what mattered was how people responded when evidence proved them wrong. Everyone makes mistakes. What you do next is what defines character, not what you did when you didn't know better. The words hit Victoria harder than condemnation would have, grace she didn't deserve, but desperately needed permission to grow past failure rather than being defined by it forever. She nodded, understanding that this was both forgiveness and dismissal, that Marcus was releasing her from guilt, but not inviting relationship or connection that might complicate the careful boundaries he'd established between his life and anyone who threatened the stability Dylan needed. She offered her business card gesture that felt inadequate, but was all she had available. Sterling and Hayes was looking for Director of Security Operations. If he was interested, the position was his no-interview necessary executive-level compensation and authority to build department however he saw fit. The offer wasn't charity or guilt, was recognition of competence she'd witnessed and company's genuine need for someone who understood crisis management in ways that transcended theoretical training. Marcus accepted the card with same non-committal courtesy he'd shown hotel owner, neither accepting nor refusing, preserving option to decline if that served him better than advancement that came with visibility and demands that might conflict with being present for Dylan in ways that mattered more than salary or title. He thanked her politely, stepped back to indicate conversation was concluding, turned toward parking lot where his truck waited to carry him home, to apartment where 7-year-old boy was waking up and wondering if Dad had come home like he always promised. Before he could leave, General Hayes reappeared with delegation that included hotel management, displaced gala attendees, and several veterans who'd been present during the evening's chaos. The group had assembled in lobby waiting for Marcus to return inside for conversation Hayes indicated was important and wouldn't take long but required Marcus's presence, for reasons that would become clear once everyone was gathered. Marcus's exhaustion was visible now, body running on reserves that had depleted hours ago. But Hayes's expression suggested this wasn't optional, that refusing would create complications worse than whatever this gathering required. He followed Hayes back inside through main entrance instead of service corridors, crossing threshold into spaces where guests belonged and staff remained invisible unless crisis demanded otherwise. The lobby had been hastily organized into assembly that suggested ceremony rather than casual conversation. Veterans stood in formation that spoke to military background, even when age and civilian clothing obscured the discipline that still governed how they carried themselves. Hotel staff lined walls, security personnel positioned near exits, management clustered near front desk where they could observe without dominating space that belonged to others. Hayes positioned himself at center, commanding attention through presence that required no formal announcement. His voice carried across lobby with authority that silenced ambient conversation and focused everyone's attention on words he'd clearly prepared during the time Marcus had been outside processing offers he hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. The speech acknowledged what had happened, how close disaster had come, how many lives would have been lost if not for competence and courage demonstrated by someone most people in the room had never noticed until crisis forced recognition of worth that had been invisible when measured by conventional metrics. Hayes detailed Marcus's actions, methodically building case that this wasn't luck or accident but expertise deployed by professional who'd spent years learning how to function when everything fell apart and panic paralyzed people who hadn't been trained to operate under conditions where mistakes meant death. Then Hayes revealed what Marcus had spent 3 years keeping private, information that recontextualized everything people had witnessed and transformed him from maintenance worker into something else entirely. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed, United States Army, combat engineer, explosive ordnance disposal specialist, 10 years service, Bronze Star, honorable discharge. Single father who'd left military career to raise his son after tragedy. Took his wife and left him sole parent to child who needed him more than country needed another soldier. The revelation landed like physical force, reshaping how everyone in the room understood what they'd witnessed and who Marcus Reed actually was beneath uniform he wore now and anonymity he'd cultivated so carefully. Faces shifted from curiosity to recognition, to something approaching awe as they processed that the man who'd saved them had done so with skills acquired in places where failure wasn't embarrassment but death. And every decision carried weight measured in lives rather than quarterly reports. Hayes stepped away from center, moving toward Marcus with deliberate formality that suggested this wasn't spontaneous gesture, but planned ceremony that had been building toward specific moment. The general's posture straightened, shoulders squared, hand rising in crisp salute that needed no explanation because everyone present understood military courtesy. Even if they'd never served, the salute held longer than protocol required, sustained acknowledgement that transcended rank and hierarchy, and became something more fundamental about respect between people who'd both served and understood what that service demanded. Other veterans in the lobby responded automatically, hands rising in echo of Hayes's gesture formation, coalescing around shared recognition that Marcus Reed deserved acknowledgement he'd never sought and had actively avoided because visibility threatened stability he'd prioritized above all else. Marcus stood frozen by surprise that rapidly transitioned into understanding that this moment couldn't be deflected or declined, that refusing to acknowledge would dishonor not just himself but everyone who'd raised their hands in gesture. That meant something beyond simple gratitude. He didn't return the salute because he wasn't in uniform and protocol didn't require it, but his posture straightened fractionally, recognition passing between him and Hayes that transcended words and confirmed that some bonds persisted regardless of time elapsed or distance traveled from places where they'd been forged. Dylan would ask about this later, would want to know why people saluted Daddy and what it meant and whether Dad was important like the man on TV had said. Marcus would explain as much as 7-year-old could understand about service and sacrifice, and how sometimes doing the right thing meant other people noticed even when you'd tried very hard to remain invisible because invisibility was protection. And protection was what Dylan needed more than Dad needed recognition. Applause began slowly building until it filled the lobby with sound that felt both overwhelming and insufficient for acknowledging what had happened and what it represented. Marcus endured it with visible discomfort, neither accepting nor fleeing, maintaining presence that satisfied observers while protecting boundaries he'd spent years establishing. When silence finally returned, he spoke briefly, thanking everyone while deflecting credit towards circumstances and training and the simple fact that someone needed to act. And he'd had the skills necessary when crisis demanded response. The gathering dispersed, gradually people returning to their displaced lives while Marcus extracted himself from conversations that wanted to extend recognition into relationship he wasn't interested in pursuing. Victoria lingered near edge of lobby watching but not approaching, understanding that she'd been given her moment and further interaction would violate boundaries he'd established through body language that said clearly he was done with public acknowledgement and needed to return to private life that mattered more than anything that had happened here. Hayes caught him near the exit, final conversation absent of audience or ceremony. The general's offer was simple, presented without pressure or expectation that Marcus would accept. Defense contractors needed people with his expertise. Training positions, consulting work, crisis management roles that paid well and offered flexibility around family obligations that took priority over everything else. The offer came with contact information and timeline that extended indefinitely because good people were worth waiting for, and Hayes understood that decisions affecting children required careful consideration rather than immediate response. Marcus accepted the business card, third one collected this morning, small stack of opportunities that represented recognition he'd spent 3 years avoiding, and wasn't certain he wanted even now that crisis had stripped away carefully maintained anonymity. He thanked Hayes with genuine respect, promised to consider the offer seriously, excused himself before exhaustion overwhelmed discipline that was barely holding. The drive home occurred in fugue state where consciousness maintained minimal function necessary for safe operation, while mind processed events that had compressed too much experience into too few hours. Sunrise painted Chicago streets in colors that felt unreal light, too bright after nights spent in smoke and emergency lighting in corridors, where visibility was measured in inches rather than miles. Traffic was light, morning commute not yet begun. city still transitioning from night shift to day shift in rhythm. Marcus usually occupied during gap between when most people slept and when they woke. The apartment building looked exactly as it always did. Familiar to point of invisibility shelter that had become home through repetition rather than any particular attachment to structure that housed, but didn't define the life he'd built for Dylan. Miss Callahan's car was in its usual spot. Confirmation she'd stayed through the night as promised, maintaining routine that helped 7-year-old believe world was stable even when Dad's work schedule became unpredictable. Dylan was awake when Marcus entered, small body wrapped in blanket on couch where cartoons played at low volume. The boy's face transformed when he saw his father, fear that had been carefully hidden, releasing into relief that Dad had come home like he always did, like he always promised, like Dylan needed to believe would continue happening forever. Because losing one parent made the possibility of losing the other unbearable even when reason said Dad was just at work and would return safely. Marcus crossed the room, lifted Dylan into embrace that felt like coming home after deployment to places that couldn't be discussed, places that had taught him exactly how much separation cost when measured in small faces that aged years during months apart. Dylan wrapped arms around his neck with grip that suggested he'd been more worried than he'd admitted, that reassurances from Mrs. Callahan hadn't fully convinced him that Dad was safe. When news reported fire at hotel where Dad worked, and nobody could confirm whether maintenance staff had been injured. Mrs. Callahan appeared from kitchen with coffee and understanding expression, asking no questions about why Marcus looked like he'd survived disaster, just providing caffeine and space for whatever conversation needed to happen between father and son who'd been separated longer than either preferred. She gathered her belongings, confirmed Dylan had eaten breakfast, mentioned there was fresh drawing on Marcus's pillow, excused herself with efficiency that came from years of being exactly the kind of help single parents desperately needed. Marcus sat with Dylan, drinking coffee that was too hot, but woke him up enough to function through conversation about why Dad looked tired and smelled like smoke and had been gone all night when he'd said 11 o'clock, and it was now almost 8 in the morning. The explanation came carefully calibrated for 7-year-old understanding, emphasizing that people had needed help and Dad had skills to help them, and sometimes work took longer than expected. But Dad always came home eventually because nothing mattered more than being here for breakfast and bedtime and everything in between. Dylan accepted this with wisdom that suggested he understood more than Marcus gave him credit for. Had already processed that Dad's job sometimes involved danger. Because adults tried to hide things, but children noticed tension and overheard conversations and drew conclusions that were frequently more accurate than comfortable. He asked if Dad was a hero like the man on TV had said, voice carrying hope that his father was special, even if specialness came with risks that terrified 7-year-old, who'd already lost too much. Marcus pulled his son closer, considering how to answer question that had no simple response. Because hero meant different things depending on who was using the word and why. He settled for truth that felt manageable. I helped people who needed help. That's what we do when we can, regardless of whether anyone calls it heroic or notices it all. Being there for you every day matters more than anything I did last night. The answer satisfied Dylan in ways that elaborate explanation wouldn't have. Confirmation that Dad valued being Dad above everything else, and nothing that happened at work would change priority that had governed their lives since Mom died and world became smaller but safer through Marcus's deliberate choice to prioritize presence over advancement. They made pancakes together, Dylan's favorite rhythm, familiar enough to be comforting after night that had stripped away too many familiar things, and left Marcus uncertain about what happened next and whether the invisibility he'd cultivated could survive exposure that had come from saving lives in ways that demanded recognition he'd never wanted. The business cards were in his pocket, opportunities that represented different future than the one he'd been building, paths that led away from careful anonymity toward visibility that came with complications he wasn't certain Dylan needed in life, that worked even if it looked small by conventional metrics. But that decision could wait until exhaustion didn't cloud judgment, until he'd had time to think about what mattered and what success looked like when measured against 7-year-olds' needs rather than adult ambitions. For now, there were pancakes to flip and cartoon to watch and small hand to hold while they ate breakfast in an apartment that was home. Because it contained everything that mattered, even if it would never impress anyone measuring worth by square footage or location or any other metric that forgot the only real measurement was whether people you loved felt safe enough to be themselves without pretending to be more or less than what they were.